So if you haven't had your coffee now, I would say don't bother. The next speaker is going to inject you with so much adrenaline, you won't need a cup of coffee. We have with us Sanjeev Sanyal. He has walked and been at the most of the top economic policy making offices in the country. He was a former banker, and in 2017, he was appointed the principal advisor to the to the finance minister. Now he serves as a member at the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister. He's one of the most popular voices both within and outside the government. He's also a popular historian and a very popular commentator on economic and policy reforms. So with that, I'm looking forward to having a discussion with him on a vision for Indian economy. Welcome, Sanjeevji. Would you like to open the discussion? Start with your opening remarks.
So, thank you, Kishen, and a very good afternoon, Cambridge. How are you all doing? Good. So I have to say some polite things for 10 minutes, I am told. Let me get going. Well, this meeting event takes place at a very interesting point in India's economic history. This financial year, India will turn $4 trillion in terms of size. This will make it about the same size as Japan. Of course, we've been helped by the Japanese yen coming down, so it's not entirely our effort, I must admit. But nevertheless, India will this financial year cross the $4 trillion mark in a nominal dollar terms, which makes us, as I said, about the same size as Japan. We remain the fastest growing economy in the world by some margin. Last year, as many of you know, we grew at 8.2%, which came as a bit of a surprise to us as well, I must also admit. But this year, we should do more than 7%, and that too will be faster than pretty much any major economy in the world. Now, when people come up with these numbers, what does it really mean? And what I'm going to talk to you a little bit about is to give you a sense of why these numbers are now bringing India to a critical mass where the sheer compounding process will really begin to talk. Now, all of you have studied compound interest rates in high school, and you know they are powerful, but very often people begin to forget how powerful they really are. So I'm going to really illustrate this for you vividly. When India began to liberalize its economy in 1991, India's economy in nominal dollar terms was only 270 billion. That's how small India's economy was. It took us 16, 17 years to cross the first $1 trillion mark. Yeah, it happened, oddly enough, in the middle of the global financial crisis in 2007-8. That's when we hit a $1 trillion mark. It then took another 7 years for India to hit the $2 trillion mark, which happened in 2014-15. Now, from there, it should have taken 5 years, but then we lost 2 years to COVID. So it took another 7 years to hit the $3 trillion mark, which happened in the year just very recently in 2021-22. Since then, just 3 years to get the next $1 trillion, which is this year. We will cross $4 trillion. Now we will need only 2 years to hit $5 trillion unless some major unforeseen shock happens, which can, of course, obviously happen. But apart from some major shock, we will cross $5 trillion in 24 months from now, and so on and so forth. And even if we keep up the current pace, so not any faster, 7% in real terms, plus a little bit of inflation and some adjustment for exchange rate, we will end up in 2047, when we'll be 100 years as an independent country, we would be somewhere in the range of a $30 to $32 trillion economy, right? So I'm just telling you why compounding is so powerful. Now, whenever I say this, somebody I know is going to say, yes, but what about relative prices? What about purchasing power parity and all this kind of thing? So let me tell you the same story in purchasing power parity terms and in terms of the share of of the world economy. And here it is equally vivid. So in 1980, the US was by some margin the world's largest economy with a share in PPP terms of 21% of the world economy. Okay? India was only 3% of the world economy. And China, after all the joys of Maoist policies, cultural revolution, etc., was not even 2.5% of the world economy. Then the Chinese, a little bit before us, began to improve and liberalize the economy and have more rational policies and so on. And a little bit later, in 1991 onwards, we also began to liberalize our economy and began to improve it. So by the year 2000, China's economy and their share of the world GDP in PPP terms rose to 7.2%. America's dropped to somewhere in the 16-17% range. And ours also rose from 3% to 4%. Today, in PPP terms, China is by some margin the world's largest economy with a share of 19% of the world economy. Okay? They're almost where the US was in 1980. The US in US dollar nominal terms is still the world's largest economy, but in PPP terms, it is a distant second with a share of 15.4%. And we are at around about 8%. So in PPP terms, we are more than half the size of the US economy is, and we are growing much faster than the US, and also faster now than China. Now, how did China get here when it was pretty much at the same level as we were a generation ago? Well, compounding. They grew by a few percentage points more than us and compounded it. This is why compounding is the single most important thing we need to do, and focus it and do it for a generation, and you reach a completely different level. Therefore, first point I'd like to make is whatever is needed to compound this needs to be done, and we should never get too excited about trying to maximize growth in a particular year, because this is about sustaining it for a period of time. Now, despite becoming the world's third largest economy in about 2 years' time, when we will go past Japan and then Germany, we will still be a very poor economy. Not surprising. We will be the world's third largest economy, but of course the world's largest population. So once you divide one by the other, we are still a poor country. In PPP terms, our annual per capita income is about $10,100. In nominal terms, it's much, much less. It's not even. It's now 2,800 or thereabouts. It'll be a little over 3,000. But in PPP terms, we are now reaching the point of 10,100. And again, as I said, compounding. So the game, as I said, is to keep this going. To keep it going, there are three important mantras that we will use, at least as for the time being and probably into the foreseeable future. So what are those sort of principles, broad principles, that will guide our economic policy? The first and most important thing is to realize that we are unapologetic supply-siders. So we intend to keep investing in the supply capability, the productive capability of our economy to keep this GDP growth process going. This requires building infrastructure. This requires continuous reforms, sometimes structural reforms, sometimes nuts and bolts process reforms, something I spend a lot of time doing, and I could talk about it a lot more. But it is important to keep doing this. We'll occasionally hear some well-known economists make statements to the effect that India is growing faster because we are a poor economy and we are just catching up. Well, we were even poorer in the 1960s and 70s. So why weren't we growing fast then? There are lots of poorer countries than India. Why aren't they growing faster than us? So policies matter, and a single-minded focus on keeping growth going matters. Number one. Second, macroeconomic stability is absolutely critical. So if you look at the amount of effort we have put in to make sure that inflation is anchored, remember we used to be an 8 to 12% inflation country, not an Argentina type inflation country, but a high inflation country. And we have now anchored it well into the 2 to 6% range, which is our which is our inflation target. Occasionally we have been outside it, but very rarely. And the Monetary Policy Committee has done a good job of anchoring our inflation here. We have continuously accumulated foreign exchange reserves. Many people crib that, why have we accumulated so much foreign exchange reserves? Precisely because we have this worldview that we need to create buffers. And we have now about $650-something billion worth of foreign exchange reserves, which is interestingly more than our external debt. So India is actually, by a small margin, a net creditor country to the rest of the world. Remember that. We have cleaned up our banks. They're among the most well-capitalized, profitable banks in the world, and so on and so forth. Why are we so fixated on macro stability? Because of history. If you go back to the 90s, there were several countries, particularly in Southeast Asia, which were called the Asian tigers. Thailand, Malaysia, etc. With the Asian crisis of 1997-98, many of them fell off that thing. They had serious problems in their financial sector and so on. And they never came back. Yes, they recovered from that crisis, but they never quite got back on the rails of high growth. So this is the point I'm making, is that we should never, you might get lucky and sustain it like China and then have the problems that they're having now. But let's be very clear. They are the exception. Many, many countries have had, Latin America has plenty of such examples as well. Argentina once used to be a high-growth country. So do not ever sacrifice macro stability for a year or two of high growth. Because once you fall off the rails, it's very difficult to get back on it. So that's the second point, macro stability. And we have demonstrated it. In the height of COVID, we maintained significant macro stability. Yes, we did spend a little bit more on stabilization on the fiscal side, monetary side, but compared to, say, the UK or most Western countries, we were very, very restrained, at the risk of facing a lot of personal criticism, by the way, which I faced from Western economists and Indian economists based in the US, for example, had many things to say about me personally at that time. But I think I've been proved right on this. So, macro stability. The third thing is, while we keep all this growth going, we're keeping it stable, there will be a section of the population that needs direct support. This fits with our concept of targeting absolute poverty. We have a term called Antodaya. Antodaya literally means the rise of the bottom or the last. So this is a concept of targeting absolute poverty. We will continue to do direct transfer of support, whether it's in terms of DBT, which is direct benefit transfers to the Jan Dhan accounts, or helping them build their houses through the Prime Minister's Awas Yojana, or giving them gas cylinders, whatever it is, direct support. And I want to contrast this with the debate that may be happening in the West, which may or may not be pertinent to the West, which is that of inequality. Because much of that debate then diverts our attention into how many billionaires there should or shouldn't be in India. Let me be very clear. We are 1/6 of the world's population. I'm of the view we should have 1/6 of the world's billionaires. Piketty is not going to create those jobs. It is Tata, Birla, Ambani, Adani. They are going to create the jobs, right? So we have no problem with the billionaires as long as they're following their rules, paying their taxes, and investing to create jobs. This whole corrosive discussion about billionaires, inheritance tax, wealth tax, may or may not be relevant to the West. It is an unnecessary diversion from our focus on absolute poverty. So with that, let me stop and say this is the framework that we have for pushing our agenda. supply side, growth focus, macro stability, and direct support for the very poor. And that has to be then sustained for a full generation. And as I told you, this is a game of compounding. Don't worry about how far China may look today. They got here by the same process. And this is an arithmetic point. It is not an ideological point. And it works. With that, let me hand it back.
Thank you, Sanjeev. That's a fascinating set of themes that you have set for the discussion. Let me begin with what I think is one of your fundamental contributions. So thinking about when you occupied the office around 2017, we had just finished the asset quality review. Banks were in big trouble. So you got in and you were instrumental in cleaning up of the banks and also instrumental in coming up with the IBC, the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Court. So how was that experience? And can you set the context of how important this was for the economy?
So yes, so clearly it's directly related to point number 2 that I talked about. And this is not unique to India. I mean, many emerging economies tend to end up with a banking system that is bust and then have great difficulty getting out of this. So we got into this basically, among many reasons, because during the 2007-8 global financial crisis, obviously our economy slowed down, but the policymakers of that time decided that keeping the economy going required loosening up the control strings on our bank lending. And there was a burst of lending at that time. A lot of that ended up in unproductive assets. So much so that by about 2013, 2014, there were already questions being raised about our macro stability and specifically about the viability of our banking system. In fact, we were listed as part of the Fragile Five. Now, in the subsequent few years, 2015, 16, what happened is that as this problem began to sort of explode out and began to infect other parts of the economy as well, so the non-banks and so on also began to have problems. There was an asset quality review which was done in 16, 17, which showed that clearly there were very serious problems in our banking system. So this is about the time that I joined the banks, joined the government, not the banks, as the principal economic advisor to the finance minister. And so my then boss, Finance Minister Arun Jaitley, called me in very early in my time there and said, look, you come from a banking background, so maybe you should have a look at this problem. So I looked into it, and this is the context in which this conversation is happening, is that the banks were beginning to jam up, and their lending was being restrained. There were being lots of demands on capitalization was being imposed on them. So it was further jamming up systems. And so I began to dig into this. Now, the conventional wisdom of that time was to create a bad bank. Many of my colleagues in the finance ministry, including the then chief economic advisor, wanted to create a bad bank where they could basically transfer all the bad stuff and then recapitalize the banks and get going. Now, I was I was against this, because my view is that it would effectively have created another BIFR. Those who are familiar with Indian economic history will remember this warehouse for bad assets, where all these assets would be sent off. They would stay there festering forever. Large amounts of taxpayer money would be put into them. And of course, entrepreneurs who in this would be very often just siphoning that money away. So you had all these zombie companies. And by the way, since I had worked in the rest of Asia after the Asian crisis, I had seen this happening in many other places in Southeast Asia as well. So I was totally against creating a bad bank. But that's one thing to oppose one thing, but what do you do? So when I began to go through the numbers, I discovered something very interesting. That 50 companies accounted for 70% of the problem. Just 50 companies. And 12 companies accounted for 30% of the problem. Okay? So I gave them the name Dirty Dozen. And I came up with this idea that we had this completely brand new law at that stage called the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. And maybe we should take this 50 companies and take it through that insolvency process. Now, immediately the point was raised that, look, it's a brand new thing. The NCLTs have never been tested before. How do you know this is going to work? And this is a really major thing, and supposing it fails. So my argument, which I first took to the then banking secretary, a lady called Anjali Dugal. And then I took to the head of IBBI, Dr. Sahu, and finally to the Reserve Bank. And once I'd convinced them, and I took it to Finance Minister Jaitley, and the argument was the following. The complicatedness of a case is uncorrelated to the size of a case, right? Now, most of the 12 cases, as it turned out to be, were steel companies and stuff like that. Very simple cases. So all we needed to do was to bankrupt them and sell them off. And so we began doing that. And nobody believed this would happen, but some of India's largest companies got bankrupted and sold off. And when we did that, it dramatically changed the credit culture of the country. And suddenly of the other 38 companies, hardly any of them actually had to be bankrupted. Many of their promoters came back and paid back the money. So suddenly in 2018, 2019, our banks were flush with money. And it didn't happen a moment too soon, because in 2020, of course, we got hit by the COVID crisis. If this had not got solved and we had the 2017 banks in 2020, we would have had a serious problem in the middle of COVID with our banking system just breaking down. So, this is something we managed to do. And as I said, many people helped in this. There was, as I said, Banking Secretary Anjali Dugal, Dr. Sahu of IBBI. There were several of the deputy governors of RBI, including Viral Acharya, with whom I disagreed on monetary policy bitterly, but on this we worked very closely together. But in the end, it got cleaned up, and we, as I said, have a great banking sector now.
Thank you. I want to take you back to the first initial points that you made. While the great convergence is the story of the century, there's also a fascinating thing happening in Europe. Now, most of the European countries are about 50 or 60% of the US GDP per capita. Their downfall is somewhat apparent to many people. How should India prepare for this new world order? Is it going to affect our way of thinking about the global economy?
So there are multiple ways in which this affects us. First of all, the relative decline of Europe is, quite clear. But it is a problem for us because this stagnation means that there is one big market to whom we cannot export. And in fact, the general dysfunction of the global economy, not just of Europe, is that, at least for now, we cannot do what China did in its high growth phase in the 2000s, because we cannot export our way to 8, 9, 10% GDP growth rate. Last year, we did 8.2%, but let me say, we did it with no help really from exports. We're getting a little bit of help from services exports, which are doing okay, but frankly, it's not generating those kinds of growth, and certainly merchandise exports was pretty dead for several years. It's doing a little bit better now, but that fire is not there. So we are having to generate these growth rates from entirely internally generated dynamics, which maybe we can sustain for a while, but it does mean that we cannot press accelerator to generate higher growth, because if we attempted to do that, our imports would begin to grow faster than we could possibly export. And immediately, rule number 2 that I had discussed earlier would come into play. So this is, for now, a big constraint to us that, an important part of the world is in disarray. Even the US, although it is growing with all kinds of stresses. I mean, at least in my view, their fiscal policy is way too loose, their monetary policy is way too tight, and they're trying to control the stresses of their fiscal policy with monetary policy, which is not efficient. But all of that means that global monetary conditions are far tighter than should be under these current situations, and so on and so forth. So I can go and talk a lot, but the point is, the world is not as conducive to an export-generated pathway, which I would have preferred for. But that is how things are. So for now, keep your head low, keep investing in domestic generated, don't overdo it, and keep it going. The world goes through cycles. At some point it'll turn, the world will begin growing at some point, and then by that time, hopefully we will have moved enough of global capacities and supply chains to India to take full advantage of it.
Thank you. Now, I want to take you to, a key document that you've helped prepare many times, the Economic Survey of Government of India. And for people who have not read one of these surveys, it's actually a fascinating document. It's far-reaching and very broad. So there are things that discuss even beyond economics. So I want to take you to one of your things that you frequently comment on, is legal reforms. If you want to pick a couple of, 2 or 3 top most legal reforms that you would look for in the next coming 25 years, what did they look like?
So you're absolutely right. I have 2 pet peeves. So there are lots of reforms I want to get done, but there are 2 major reforms that I always argue need to be done. To understand the context of this, you take a little bit of a longer history. See, what are the reforms we have done since 1991? At a very broad level, they are about withdrawing the Indian state from things it should not do. Right? That's why the word liberalization and reform are usually spoken of in the same breath. But from here on, we need to get the Indian state to do the things it should do. Right? And the 2 things it needs to do is general administration, which the bureaucracy does, and the other is delivery of justice and enforcement of contracts, which is what the judiciary is supposed to do. And therefore, these are the 2 areas, big structural reforms, which won't happen in a sudden. These are generational reforms. Take us decades to do, but we've got to start now. These are the 2 big areas of reforms that I think. I mean, it makes no sense for us to have some 40 million cases stuck in our judicial system. We've got to do something about it. And, I can give a long lecture on a million things that need to be done, from speeding up the process to reducing the number of vacations that a higher judiciary takes, and so on, much of which becomes, much disliked by the bar associations if you just Google it up. But point of the matter is we need to create a modern legal system that enforces contracts on time, delivers justice on time. And I think if there are 2 things in which we need to invest in, the bang for the buck would be the highest, it would be in these 2 reforms.
Got it. Before I open up to the audience, I have one last question. So this has got to do with the recent comment that you made on the UPSC, which is the predominant way of recruiting bureaucrats. You called it, poverty of aspirations. I would like if you could tell us more about what you envision to be some of the bureaucratic reforms that I think most people would agree that we do need a change. How do we think about this?
So this comment was not about the bureaucracy, actually. It was specifically about the culture of taking this test. And this culture has now, in my view, gone completely out of hand. Literally, hundreds of thousands of people, tens of hundreds of thousands of people take exams for the UPSC, where only about some 1,200 people get through. Okay? The success rate, I calculated, is less than 0.1%. It's something like 0.08%. Okay? So hundreds of thousands of people are taking an exam, and basically, you have a near 100% chance of failure. Now, this is completely ridiculous. And it's not the dumb kids of the class that are taking this, right? Typically, a family will take the brightest kid in their family who's done well, put them in the system where they may spend 5-6 years living in some place like Mukherjee Nagar. They'll spend money on coaching classes. So it's not a cheap enterprise. So bright kids at their prime of their life, spending money to take an exam where they're almost 100% not going to succeed, by definition. Now, there is no bigger waste of time than I can imagine. It's perfectly okay for those who get through, by the way. That is not the point I'm making. Right? If you really want to do this, yeah, go ahead, take a couple of shots, it works great. So quite different from, this is not about administrative reform, which I will come to shortly. But the issue of this whole culture. And why are there so many kids doing it? Well, partly because there is a huge amount of social pressure, parents. Many of these kids have no interest in the civil service, by the way. Many of them just become habituated to taking these exams. I actually know civil servants who succeeded, got through to, say, the Indian Revenue Service, and then took the exam again to get into the Indian Administrative Service. I mean, this is basically opium. Okay, so the point I'm making is that there is a whole culture to it. There's a huge amount of resources now. These coaching systems have got a lot of resources. They're raking in the money. They are, there's a huge ecosystem even pumping movies out to promote this, called 12th Fail or Pass or whatever it is. Point is, this is madness. If such a large number of young kids with so much talent are putting in so much effort into literally anything else, we will get more Nobel laureates, more billionaires, more gold medals in the Olympics, all kinds of other things. Why are we doing this? And this is a national effort to the most pointless thing on earth. So I made a comment in a podcast saying that, this is a poverty of aspiration. If you must aspire for something, aspire to be Elon Musk. Why do you want to be a joint secretary? And then a lot of these coaching classes, which have these motivational speakers, they got all very annoyed with me. And if you Google, go to the YouTube and write Sanjeev Sanyal UPSC, there are at least 50 videos by these motivational speakers on how evil I am. Several of them, interestingly, are former bureaucrats who now run coaching classes after having resigned from the service. So my point is, this is great. This is exactly what I want you to do. Become entrepreneurs. Do, not what you say.
With that, let me open the questions to the audience, from the audience. I will take 2 questions at once because there will be many. Let's begin with the gentleman there. And then, and just right behind the lady there.
Hi, Sanjeev. So my question is going to be on economics, borderline geopolitics. I think Sonia talked about global south, and the borderline emotional. So my name is Praful. I'm an entrepreneur based in Cambridge, startup. Raised a few $1 million in investments, very good.
Let's keep the question very brief, please. We have 5 minutes.
That's the background context. Do you think in the near future, I'm going to make the same statement, or a future entrepreneur is going to make the same statement of raising that money globally in Indian rupees?
Absolutely. There's no question about the fact that our own capital markets are rapidly growing. Indian equity markets are now global sizes. They're not small by any size. The quality of the infrastructure, the number of transactions, the sheer size of money that will be raised in this financial year will be world-class, world-size. So absolutely. And we have now creating another unit which is like a safety valve to the rest of the world called Gift City. What Hong Kong was to China, we are building Gift as to India. And so it's sort of like an offshore center for people like yourselves, maybe. And so both between Mumbai and Gift, we intend for our financial system's ability to raise money to be in serious scale. And we are absolutely moving in that direction. As far as the rupee is concerned, that too. We are systematically internationalizing the rupee, as you may be aware. We are increasingly allowing more and more of our trade. In fact, we've allowed more or less for our trade to now be denominated in rupees, to be settled in rupees. There are many bilateral stuff that we are doing on payments systems, etc., for places like the UAE, Singapore, and so on. France, interestingly, where our UPI system is being now allowed, so anyone should be able to go and pay through our payment system, and so on. And of course, the rupee itself is being internationalized. Now, what do you want for an internationalized rupee? You basically, first of all, need to have macroeconomic stability. People should believe that the rupee is a stable currency. So we have now, since 2016, demonstrated, So now for 8 years demonstrated that India is a well-regulated monetary system which can maintain the value of its rupee, i.e. control inflation. We have demonstrated that. We now, as I said, are a small creditor country to the world. We continue to have a payment system that is increasingly, internally it is world-class, but globally also we are able to function. We already have actually internally inside India a system of payments messaging called SFMS, which is better than SWIFT. And we are happy to, give it to the rest of the world, and so on and so forth. So all the microstructures needed for creating a international rupee is being put in place. Now, at this point, somebody always takes the conversation towards de-dollarization. And let me say this is unconnected. We merely want to be a hard currency like the other existing hard currencies, like the Singapore dollar, British pound, yen, euro, and so on. We are not trying to replace the dollar as the world anchor currency. That is not our aspiration at all. But we do want to be a hard currency and to be a part of the SDR basket of the IMF in about 8-9 years' time.
Just the lady there.
Hi, good afternoon, Mr. Sanyal. Thank you so much for that invigorating and insightful discussion. I am Kainath Pundir. I am a lawyer interested in trade policy and sustainability. So that's also where my question comes from. We were talking about where the future of India lies, and there is a lot of promise in terms of economic growth. What I wanted to ask you about is where do you see sustainability play into this discussion, specifically looking into carbon taxes being introduced across the West, which is seen as a celebration in the West of this is where the future of international trade lies. But there is also a lot of pushback from the global South, including India, that the West has polluted and has been a contributor towards climate change over the years. And now, since the global South is undergoing that industrialization, that charge of the tax should not be on the global South. So where do you see that playing into the Indian economic policy going forward? Thanks.
So let me say we take sustainability very, very seriously at multiple levels. So I'll keep the conversation to energy. It's not the only kind of sustainability we need to think about, but let's take energy. See, India, for whatever it's worth, is not blessed with large amount of hydrocarbons. We are poor in oil, we are poor in natural gas, we have a little bit of coal, but frankly, not that much, even of that. So we import all of our carbon-based energy. So even if there was no climate change, we would want to shift because the gods may not have given us hydrocarbons, they've given us plenty of sunshine. And we get it at exactly the time we want it, which is in summer, because our energy uses spike right now in Delhi, the highest ever. So it coincides. We have lots of sun, we get it at exactly the time we want it. So we are sold with solar because that works to our advantage anyway, plus other things as well, things like nuclear energy and so on. We will not, however, go one way on this. We recognize that there are certain problems with these renewables because of spikes, their ability to deal with spikes and so on. So we will continue to build some conventional energy capacities as well, because we are expanding so fast and our energy requirements are growing so fast that we need to also invest in some of the conventional sources, although the mix will clearly change quite rapidly because we will build a lot more of one compared to the other. So to answer your first question is, are we doing an energy transition and are we serious about it? Absolutely. We are doing lots of investments. In fact, we are at the cutting edge of certain areas like green hydrogen. We are probably the biggest investor in the world into that technology. So that is to answer the question. Now, as far as the rest of the world's taxes and all these kinds of things are concerned, let me say that we are happy about some of it and suspicious about some of the others. And I'll give you the example here of ESG. Now, those of you not familiar with ESG, it stands for the norms related to environmental, social, and governance norms, yeah? Now, I have no problems with having some international rules about environmental, social, and governance issues. But the way it is all coming together suggests that it is some sort of a rent-seeking effort by North Atlantic NGOs and consultancies, and even by academia, because academia has also found this as being some sort of a money-spinning system. I'm 100% sure Cambridge has all these new ESG courses which are skimming, charging large amounts of money from poor students. So, the best thing they could do is do it free, since it's socially beneficial. But the point is, this is a scam. I'll tell you why. Let me give you the history of this. In 2016, a paper came out, an innocuous paper from the UN, talking for the first time about ESG. It didn't define what ESG was, and everybody said, yes, yes. I mean, after all, who's going to say we shouldn't have some environmental, social, and governance norms? And so there it remained, till it slowly began to find its way through various think tanks and academia and other people, began to define what these norms was. Now, I want to be clear that there was no global conference to decide on any of this. It was unilaterally decided by some of these groups, all of them in the North Atlantic. In fact, there's not even a large number of them. Much of the way these things are defined by I dug into this, is defined by a tiny number of think tanks, actually. All of them in the North Atlantic, and they are funded by the same people. And let me name them. All these think tanks are funded by George Soros' Open Society. They're funded by a couple of EU agencies, Ford Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation. Right? And then they have funded a whole bunch of other agencies which are funded in other agencies. It reminds me a little bit about how money is laundered. This is how ideology is laundered. And without any conversation with the rest of the world, we have had these norms have now been imposed on everybody else. Okay? And now, you cannot function in many industries, particularly if you're exporting to, for example, the European Union. You cannot do this without having to comply with these norms. But where did the norms come from? Who are these North Atlantic agencies who decide whether you're a good boy or a bad boy and give you certifications? And in every one of these cases, they're effectively skimming jizya. This is a form of jizya tax, rent seeking. So it has to be called out. And I would go so far as to say, this is a form of neo-colonial control that is being imposed by the North Atlantic on the rest of the world. And we will oppose it. I have no problem with environmental, social, and governance norms. I do have a problem with having these norms without any discussion with anybody else. Green steel, for example, is defined in a very peculiar way. It is defined in a way which requires you to do processes where all the patents are held in the same North Atlantic countries. How convenient. So I am going to argue that, yes, we need to have maybe some sort of a global norms, but those norms can only be imposed if there is an equitable discussion across the table with all the players. At least India, because we are a large economy and so on, we can talk loudly about it. Go to Africa. All these norms are applied on all of them. And none of them have a voice in any of the norms that are applied upon them. And who is to say these things are, if you're going to talk about governance and a rule-based order, the question is, whose rules? So I am very, very suspicious about this whole ESG effort as it has turned out. And as I said, this is essentially a scam being run by North Atlantic consultancies, NGOs, and I'm sorry, increasingly North Atlantic academic institutions.
So with that, we have run out of time. Thank you so much, Sanjeev Sanyal.